faithfully conveying value and interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today I'm going to interpret this book called Stalingrad for you. The author is a British military historian and visiting professor at Birkbeck College, University of London, and Kent University. In today's southwestern Russia near Ukraine stands a city called Volgograd. It backs onto Russia's mother river, the Volga, about 913 kilometers north of Moscow, and serves as a key transportation hub, linking Europe and Asia. Now, over 70 years ago, when it was still called Stalingrad, a world-shocking battle took place, the Battle of Stalingrad. The Soviet and German armies deployed around 3 million troops total. They fought desperately, with casualties exceeding 1.6 million. Ultimately, the Soviets won and the Germans suffered a crushing defeat. This is widely seen as the great turning point of World War II, where the once invincible German army started its decline. The Soviets then launched a counteroffensive, eventually capturing Berlin and securing victory in the European theater of 1042. For decades, research on this has piled up like mountains. And today, this book, Stalingrad 2042, has two major highlights compared to similar works. First, the author graduated from military academy and served in the army, so he's super familiar with tactics, making battle scenes accurate and vivid. Second, he excels at using archives, documents, battlefield diaries, soldiers' letters, etc., to vividly show changes in both sides' situations and mindsets, letting readers feel war's devastation of humanity. Now, I'll break this book into three parts. Part 1, The Road to Stalingrad.
Part 2, From a Do-or-Die Battle to a Miraculous Turnaround.
Part 3, The Destruction of the German Army and the Battle's Significance. Now, let's get started. Part 1, The Road to Stalingrad. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, and World War II officially broke out. In less than a year, countries like Poland, France, the Netherlands, and Norway fell one after another. Almost all of Western Europe fell under Nazi control, with only the isolated British Isles holding out desperately. The smug Hitler then turned his gaze eastward. From the moment he took power, he clamored to gain living space for the Germanic people. Here, the so-called living space mainly refers to the vast, resource-rich lands of Ukraine and Russia. Now that Western Europe has been conquered, it's time to take down the Soviet Union. In the summer of 1940, Hitler ordered the German Army General Staff to develop a plan to attack the Soviet Union. After completion, Hitler named it Operation Barbarossa. Barbarossa was the nickname of Frederick I, the 12th century German king. It means Redbeard. Frederick fought many campaigns throughout his life, gained great fame, and made Germany one of Europe's most powerful nations. Hitler had always admired him, so he named the invasion plan after his nickname. Kind of like seeking good luck. In early 1941, the German army began mobilizing troops. Allies like Italy, Hungary, and Romania also dispatched large forces. By early June, the Axis powers had amassed over 5 million troops on the Soviet-German border, plus more than 3,300 tanks, over 7,000 field guns, 2,000 aircraft, and 600,000 horses for transporting weapons and supplies. The Germans made such a big commotion, and it lasted so long. Did the Soviet side have no awareness at all? Actually, Soviet intelligence officers had long warned Moscow that Germany had plans to attack the Soviet Union. Soviet generals on the German-Soviet border also noticed frequent German troop movements, but the Supreme Commander, Stalin believed these were false intelligence spread by the British to drag the Soviet Union into the war and alleviate their own pressure. So before the war broke out, the Soviet army had barely made any proper preparations. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, the Germans used heavy artillery bombardment to sound the horn of the Soviet-German war. German warplanes bombed Soviet military airfields, destroying over 1,200 Soviet aircraft in just 9 hours. Right at the start of the war, the Soviets lost air superiority. A Soviet Air Force Major General, after inspecting the battlefield, shot himself in despair. 3 weeks later, the Soviets had accumulated losses of 3,500 tanks, 6,000 aircraft, and casualties as high as 2 million. Cities fell one after another, vast territories were lost, and the Soviet army suffered heavy blows repeatedly. Besides the lack of preparation, it was also related to the poor tactical skills of the officers and soldiers. Before War II, the Soviet Union had constant political purges. The army was also affected, with tens of thousands of officers losing their lives, including 3 marshals, 50 generals, and over 1,000 brigade and regiment-level officers. To fill the vacancies, a large number of young officers were promoted. Most had no combat experience and developed a habit of obeying superiors' orders without daring to make independent decisions. The situation for soldiers was even worse. Most Soviet soldiers came from rural areas with low education levels. Without competent officers leading them, their combat effectiveness was poor, especially pilots who generally lacked battle experience and training. So early in the war, the Soviet Air Force was no match for the Germans. A German pilot described them as helpless infants with no resistance. In contrast, many German officers and soldiers had participated in the Polish and French campaigns. With rich combat experience against rookie opponents, the Germans were virtually invincible, with morale soaring. During this period, letters from German troops were filled with boasts like, "The German army is invincible," and "We'll take Moscow in 2 months." The Soviet Supreme Commander's decisions further worsened the frontline soldiers' situation. Facing the reality of catastrophic collapse, Soviet leadership believed this was inseparable from weak fighting will among frontline troops. Thus, the Supreme Command issued Order Number 270, stipulating that troops must defend every inch of territory without retreat. Anyone who surrendered or deserted would be shot on the spot and their families punished. Sent to Siberia for hard labor, this somewhat stemmed the rout, but the side effects were equally obvious. By stubbornly holding positions, Soviet forces completely lost battlefield initiative, often getting entire divisions or armies encircled by Germans. The most devastating cost came during the Battle of Kiev.
After the war broke out, Soviet troops retreated continuously, with large forces falling back to Kiev, Ukraine's capital. Chief of Staff Shukov recommended immediate withdrawal to preserve strength.
This was rejected by the Supreme Command. The Soviets had just promised the British they'd never abandon Kiev. How could they go back on their word? Result? 660,000 Soviet troops were completely encircled and annihilated. Hitler excitedly declared this the greatest battle in world history. Of course, the Germans also made major mistakes. To strengthen the encirclement of Kiev, Hitler diverted armored groups originally headed for Moscow. When the Germans finally turned to attack Moscow, it was already October. Rain and snow swept across Russia. Winter arrived. German soldiers lacked winter uniforms. Frostbite cases surged. Muddy roads slowed armored vehicles. With terrible weather, fighters often couldn't take off. Supply lines grew strained. All this severely weakened Germany's advantages. The Soviet forces caught their breath, and the closer they got to the capital, the more fiercely they resisted. A slogan was popular at the time: "Russia is vast, but there's no retreat left. Behind us is Moscow." Everyone understood that the fall of Moscow meant national ruin. The Soviet High Command learned its lesson, delegating command to top generals like Zhukov. Finally, with united fighting spirit and U.S. aid in weapons and supplies, the Soviets won the Battle of Moscow. This was the first major blow to the Germans, giving the anti-fascist camp a huge boost. However, the main German forces weren't crippled. Although forced to retreat, they stabilized the front lines. Hitler believed that after regrouping, he could still conquer the Soviet Union. And now, in the spring of 1942, the Germans devised two plans, one called Operation Polar Star, where Army Group North would capture the industrial center and transport hub in northern Soviet Leningrad.
The other was Operation Blue, where Army Group South was tasked with seizing Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields to its south.
Specifically, Army Group South split into Groups A and B. Group A included the German 1st Panzer Army, 17th Army, and Romanian 4th Army, aiming to take the Caucasus oil fields. Group B had the German 6th Army, 4th Panzer Army, and Italian and Romanian forces pushing toward Stalingrad. In Hitler's view, capturing this city had dual significance. First, Stalingrad was a major producer of grain, oil, and coal, a heavy industrial hub rich in resources. It backed onto the Volga River and intersected with the Don River, making it southern Soviet's key transport junction. Second, this city was named after Soviet leader Stalin. Seizing it would crush Soviet morale. While the Germans were busy deploying troops, what were the Soviets up to? After Moscow's relief, Soviet morale soared, and they recaptured much lost ground. Of course, Soviet leaders knew the Germans weren't weakened. When spring came, they'd launch another offensive. Where would the main attack be? The Supreme Command thought the Germans would strike Moscow from the north, but Deputy Supreme Commander Zhukov figured the Germans were more likely to target Stalingrad to grab its rich resources.
Just as both sides were locked in dispute, Soviet troops found the Blue Operation Plan in a crashed German plane. Hitler flew into a rage upon hearing the news, but the Soviet High Command had a peculiar way of thinking.
They insisted this was fake intelligence, spread by Hitler, and warned not to be misled by him. Ultimately, the Soviets concentrated heavy forces north of Moscow without strengthening Stalingrad's defenses. On June 28, 1942, Hoth commanded the 4th Panzer Army with air support from Kursk. 2 days later, Paulus's 6th Army also began moving. The two armies, one south and one north, formed the pincer movement trying to encircle Soviet forces, officially kicking off the Battle of Stalingrad. My narration now enters part 2. From a do-or-die battle to a miraculous counterattack. Due to misjudgment, Soviet forces quickly panicked, repeating the early war route. But this time they retreated fast, foiling the German encirclement plan, though endless retreat wasn't sustainable. By mid-July, German troops were closing in on Stalingrad. If the outskirts fell and they crossed the Volga River, the Soviet Union would split north-south, a total disaster.
The Soviet High Command began gathering troops to rush south as reinforcements.
On the other hand, to stall the Germans, they used their old tactics.
Stalin signed Order Number 227, issuing a death command to frontline troops. Absolutely no retreat allowed.
Zhukov also formed special squads to shoot deserters. This seemed cruel, but the generals had their reasons. Most Soviet soldiers were recruits with just days of training, unable to aim rifles. To drive them to fight, they needed iron discipline. Meanwhile, the high command pulled troops from everywhere. At the worst times, even sailors were sent to trenches. This desperate resistance bought time for the Soviets. But the Soviets, Tom. On August 22nd, the main Soviet forces arrived at Stalingrad's outskirts and completed deployment. They were only 1 day ahead of the Germans. That precious day finally let the Soviets block the German advance. Both sides set up formations outside Stalingrad. The Soviets consisted of the 62nd, 63rd, and 64th Armies.
The Stalingrad front was commanded by Lieutenant General Chuikov. He faced the German 6th Army, led by General Paulus, with 6 corps, totaling 270,000 men.
Due to smooth progress, losses were minimal. Basically, they were fully equipped and at full strength. The Soviets, though vastly outnumbering the Germans, faced two major obstacles.
First, too many raw recruits and severe equipment shortages.
As mentioned earlier, Soviet soldiers were hastily conscripted with severe training deficiencies.
Worse still, they lacked planes, tanks, artillery, anti-tank weapons. Relying solely on rifles against fully armed Germans? That's pure fantasy.
In fact, even rifles faced ammo shortages. When Chuikov inspected troops, he found many soldiers had barely a dozen bullets. This leads to the second major obstacle: weak logistical support. Considering Stalingrad backed onto the Volga, Chuikov's plan was some troops defended the city, while the main force stayed east of the river for reinforcement. In theory, this made sense. But the problem? Germans had air superiority, and the Volga was within range of their artillery. Result? Every river crossing cost huge casualties. A survivor recalled, during crossings, German shells threw up huge water columns, drenching everyone. Boats kept getting hit nearby. Desperate screams everywhere. Terrified, everyone just stared blankly at the water. Nobody dared look toward the far bank. Survival depended purely on luck. In these conditions, getting food, ammo, medical supplies into the city was near impossible. With such massive difficulties, how could Chuikov hold off the Germans? The answer: strict battlefield discipline. He declared, "We won't tolerate any cowardice. Surrender, desertion, or self-harm are crimes punishable severely." Statistics show over 13,500 death sentences by Soviet military courts during the battle. This meant tens of thousands died for breaking rules. Strict discipline, combined with a do-or-die situation, forged fierce Soviet fighting spirit. The battle for Mamayev Kurgan was a prime example. Mamayev Kurgan is the highest point in Stalingrad. In peacetime, locals picnicked here. Such a vital high ground, Germans were determined to take it. Well, starting September 12th, Germans launched a fierce assault on Mamayev Kurgan. German bombers carpet-bombed the hill for 2 straight days. A German corporal recorded his judgment in his diary. "Under such bombardment, not even a rat could survive." But the Germans were wrong. Defending Mamayev Kurgan were the Soviet elite Guards troops. They endured intense artillery fire, repelling German attacks time and again. Germans reached the summit several times, but were soon driven back. And ultimately, each side held half the hilltop, engaging in repeated struggles that dragged on until the battle's later stages. Another strategic point was the central train station and central dock south of Mamayev Kurgan. Control changed hands multiple times. At a critical moment, Soviet NKVD troops, originally for oversight, were thrown into battle to hold the position. The factory area north of Mamayev Kurgan was also embroiled in bitter fighting. Due to troop shortages, Chuikov ordered factory workers formed into special brigades. They didn't even have time to get uniforms, going straight to battle in oil-stained work clothes. They engaged Germans in bayonet charges and hand-to-hand combat, halting enemy advances and repeatedly delaying the German timetable. Nazi propaganda repeatedly claimed the swastika flag flew high over Stalingrad's center, but the fighting never stopped. Why did the previously unstoppable German blitzkrieg struggle so hard at Stalingrad? Beyond Soviet tenacious resistance, reasons lie at strategic and tactical levels. First, strategic error, command decision. Initially, German forces attacking Stalingrad, centered on 4th Panzer Army and 6th Army of Army Group B, had enough strength. But seeing initial success, Hitler altered the plan. The 4th Panzer Army turned south to assist Army Group A in capturing the Caucasus oil fields. This severely weakened armored strength at Stalingrad. For instance, Germans attacking Mamayev Kurgan got no tank support, stalling progress. Yet Hitler only diverted 2 corps from 4th Panzer Army for help, refusing more troops. He believed Soviet military potential was exhausted. The Battle of Moscow was just a last gasp. With a bit more effort, Soviets would surrender. This was a common belief among the Nazi leadership. Influenced by this, blind optimism pervaded German ranks. For example, when besieging Stalingrad, officers encouraged soldiers, saying one charge could cross the Volga River.
But in reality, Soviets had already relocated over 1,500 factories to the Ural region. Production restarted fast, and U.S. weapons and supplies poured in continuously.
The Soviets also transferred millions from Siberia, gaining absolute numerical superiority. Tactically, with air superiority, Germans bombed Stalingrad for nearly 200 days, causing massive losses and reducing the city to ruins, demonstrating part of this ironic tactical shift. Unexpectedly, these ruins provided hiding spots for Soviet troops, forcing Germans into urban combat without firepower advantage. A German officer recorded, "We were forced to fight for every ruined street, every collapsed factory, every shattered house, even a wall or rubble heap. The ferocity was unprecedented."
Germans called this Rattenkrieg, rat warfare.
Most troublesome were Soviet snipers, who could lie hidden in ruins, patiently waiting. German soldiers fetching water, smoking, or eating bread risked bullets if they carelessly exposed themselves. Ace sniper Vasily Zaitsev killed 225 enemies in 1 month.
Throughout World War II, he eliminated about 400 Germans.
Snipers he trained killed around 10,000. The 2001 Hollywood film Enemy at the Gates was based on Zaitsev's true story.
As fighting progressed, German casualties mounted terribly.
For example, the 94th Infantry Division attacking northern factories dwindled from 10,000 plus to just 535 men, effectively destroyed. Soviet snipers caused unusually high officer casualties, leaving front units critically short of platoon and company leaders. This deeply worried 6th Army Commander Paulus, prompting Hitler to personally rally troops. But however inspiring his speeches facing ever-strengthening Soviets demoralized German troops. Meanwhile, Chuikov concentrated artillery deployments. Positioned deep on the Volga's east bank, Soviet gunners targeted German supply lines to cripple logistics. This worked brilliantly. Germans now faced food and ammo shortages too.
Second, they shelled small German units assembling for attacks, inflicting heavy losses.
By November, Germans held 80% of Stalingrad, but were spent, as Soviet resistance remained unbroken. Now the bitter winter arrived. The Volga froze solid. German offensives weakened. No matter how Hitler threatened or tempted, frontline troops were exhausted, couldn't fight anymore. As they declined, Soviets grew stronger. The Soviets began gathering strength to plan a counterattack under their supreme command. Zhukov devised a plan. Have Chuikov keep drawing enemy attention. Meanwhile, the main Soviet force would flank behind Stalingrad for a pincer move, Operation Uranus. The challenge? Soviets had to swing over 100 kilometers in an arc to encircle 300,000 Germans. Such a massive move risked detection. So, secrecy became critical. To achieve this, Soviet command did 2 things. First, mislead the Germans. They staged frequent troop movements near Moscow, pretending to reinforce southward. Hitler totally fell for it.
He thought the threat came from Moscow and ordered strengthened defenses there.
He also believed winter made large-scale Soviet offensives impossible. Meanwhile, Soviet internal secrecy was airtight, all orders verbal, no paper trails. Senior officers kept absolute secrecy. Not a word leaked to juniors. On the eve of the counterattack, a mentally strained soldier surrendered to Germans.
Clearly, they knew nothing about the imminent strike.
Thus, under German noses, Soviets amassed 1 million troops. The first strike targeted northwest Stalingrad. Romanian troops held this area, poorly equipped, low morale, easy to break. At 7:30 a.m. on November 19, 1942, the grand counteroffensive began. Thousands of artillery pieces, including Katyusha rocket launchers, roared toward enemy positions. The earth shook, waking German troops 50 kilometers away. After bombardment, Soviet tank columns charged. Romanian forces neared collapse. Even then, 6th Army Commander Paulus thought this was a feint. Trusting Hitler's judgment, he took no serious action. With German main forces stuck in urban combat, this was a godsend for the Soviets. That afternoon, Soviet tanks breached defenses from the north. Next day, Soviets attacked from Stalingrad south, routing Italian troops there. Now, Soviet forces from north and south had encircled the German 6th Army. Now, the Germans had no choice but to believe it. On November 22nd, the fourth day of the Soviet counteroffensive, German soldiers whispered to each other,
We're surrounded!
exactly. 300,000 Germans were trapped by 1 million Soviets in the Don-Volga Triangle. What awaited them? In Part 3, I'll recount the German army's destruction and the battle's significance. Initially, the Sixth Army remained confident. They trusted Hitler wouldn't abandon them. Luftwaffe Chief Göring promised full supply, and airlifts evacuated wounded, calming nerves. But this didn't last. The Sixth Army needed 700 tons daily. The Luftwaffe managed 350 max under ideal conditions. With harsh weather and Soviet AA fire, daily drops often fell below 50 tons.
Severe shortages followed. Tanks idled without fuel, ammo rationed, wounded untreated due to medical shortages.
The encircled Germans pinned their last hope on their most revered commander, Manstein. Manstein, ordered by Hitler, formed Army Group Dawn for a rescue mission. He proposed advancing north while the Sixth Army broke out southwest, maximizing success chances, but Hitler refused to abandon Stalingrad.
Paulus lacked decisiveness. The relief force stalled 60-plus kilometers from the pocket, exhausted.
Soviets counterattacked, brutally forcing them back. The rescue failed.
Temperatures plunged to minus 45 degrees Celsius. Frostbite and freezing deaths multiplied.
By late December, pocket airfields were captured, or under Soviet artillery, air supply collapsed. The Sixth Army was utterly doomed. By January 1943, they couldn't hold on. On the 15th, an entire German battalion surrendered. This was WWII's largest German unit surrender to date.
It devastated morale beyond repair.
From then on, German troops raised white flags, but surrender didn't guarantee survival. Remember, Germans treated Soviet POWs brutally. Abuse and killings were common. During War II, 8.7 million Soviets were captured. Fewer than one-third survived. They committed countless atrocities against Soviet civilians, too. On Stalingrad's first day, Germans bombed 40,000 civilians to death. They looted food and valuables, forcing civilians to march ahead as human shields. Frankly, Soviets deeply hated Germans. German POWs' fate, predictable. Siberian labor camps were lenient. On-the-spot executions happened often. Especially for SS and Gestapo, surrender meant death regardless. Worst off were the wounded. Lightly injured were forced to keep fighting. Severely wounded got no treatment, left in hospital corridors or basements. If found by Soviets, immediate execution. This attitude made some Germans fight desperately, increasing Soviet casualties. Regardless, the pocket kept shrinking. On January 26th, Soviet forces linked up in Stalingrad's northern factories, splitting the Sixth Army remnants. On February 1st, Paulus surrendered. Ironically, Hitler had promoted him to field marshal just 2 days earlier. Hitler thought Paulus would honor this rank by committing suicide rather than surrendering. He was wrong. Paulus refused pointless sacrifice, becoming Germany's first surrendering field marshal. After mopping up, Soviets declared Operation Uranus a full success. Sobering toll. Overall, Stalingrad cost Soviets over 480,000 dead and 600,000 plus wounded. German or Allied losses exceeded 500,000. Surface level, Soviet losses doubled Germany's. But war isn't decided by casualty counts alone. In reality, Stalingrad reshaped World War II's course and post-war order. The author highlights 3 points. First was WWII's turning point. Before this, Germans advanced unstoppably. The Axis seemed invincible. If Moscow broke the myth of German invincibility, Stalingrad reversed the war's entire momentum. With the Sixth Army's destruction, Germany lost large-scale offensive capability, and Soviet military industry surpassed theirs. For example, just before the Battle of Stalingrad, German factories at full capacity could make up to 500 tanks per month. What about the Soviets? 2,200. After Stalingrad, Germany's plan to seize Soviet resources failed, widening the gap between them. War isn't just about tactics and courage, it's a contest of industrial strength between enemies. Clearly, Nazi Germany was at a disadvantage, and defeat was inevitable. Second, it shook the foundation of Nazi rule. Despite Nazi propaganda efforts to cover up the defeat, news spread quietly among Germans. This awakened some Germans who still had reason and conscience. Some students at Munich University spontaneously formed the White Rose Resistance Group.
They spread messages and leaflets to tell Germans the truth. Mid-level officers led by Stauffenberg believed only killing Hitler could save Germany.
They plotted assassination, which gained support from senior generals like Rommel. In July 1944, the attempt nearly succeeded. These resistances were brutally suppressed by Nazis. The Gestapo captured White Rose members and beheaded them. Many involved in the July plot were tortured and executed, but lies would eventually be exposed. As German forces retreated repeatedly, more people realized Nazi Germany's end was near. In the late Nazi era, Germany was demoralized. Few still believed in fascism. The third significance of Stalingrad was greatly boosting Soviet international status, putting it in a favorable position in great power politics. Due to early war defeats at Stalingrad's start, Britain and America didn't favor the Soviets, especially during the toughest times. The U.S. Embassy in Moscow was filled with pessimism. Everyone thought Soviet defeat was certain. But the Soviets made a stunning comeback, impressing Britain and America. This victory greatly boosted anti-fascist morale. With heavy media promotion, Soviet heroism spread worldwide. Soviet prestige soared, and their immense sacrifices made Britain and America feel inferior. In November 1943, leaders of the U.S., Britain, and Soviet met in Tehran for a conference. British Prime Minister Churchill specially gifted Stalin the Sword of Stalingrad as a tribute. Stalin used Soviet sacrifices to demand concessions. Out of a sense of compensation, Britain and America tacitly allowed the Soviet Union to bring Eastern and Southern Europe into its sphere of influence, laying the foundation for the post-War II era. It can be said that the bloody struggle of Soviet soldiers and civilians in the Battle of Stalingrad became a crucial cornerstone for the Soviet Union's rise as a superpower. All right, that wraps up our discussion on Stalingrad. You'll find reading notes below the audio. See you next time.